May 1833. A ship called the Tuscany pulls out of Boston Harbor, riding low in the water. Below decks, sealed inside a wooden chamber packed with hay and dried tree bark, sit 180 tons of frozen New England pond water. Its destination is Calcutta, roughly 12,000 nautical miles away, in one of the hottest port cities in the British Empire. The trip will take 4 months and 7 days. The ship will cross the equator twice. Every single day, in the tropical heat below deck, the cargo will be dying. By the time the Tuscany reaches the mouth of the Hooghly River, roughly 80 tons will be gone, turned to water, turned to nothing. And yet this half-melted 4-month-old cargo of ice is about to help make a man named Frederic Tudor a millionaire. 27 years earlier, that same man was being mocked in the Boston newspapers. He would go on to spend time in debtors' prisons in both Boston and Cambridge, once over an unpaid debt of exactly $300. So here is the question this story is going to answer. How do you build a fortune from a product that is disappearing in front of you, the entire time you are trying to sell it? And here is the twist worth holding on to. The ice itself was only the raw material. In New England, nature produced it every winter. What Tudor actually got rich building was something else entirely. And the same logic still keeps food and medicine cold as they travel around the world. This is the story of the Ice King. Frederic Tudor was born in Boston in September 1783, into a family with money, status, and powerful connections. His father, William Tudor, had served as Judge Advocate General during the American Revolution and later became a prominent lawyer. Frederick's 3 brothers attended Harvard. Frederick refused. At 13, he left Boston Latin School to apprentice at a State Street merchant house, reportedly dismissing Harvard as a place for loafers. At 17, he visited Cuba and experienced tropical heat for himself. A few years later, he began speculating in commodities around Boston. Then, during the summer of 1805, the Tudor family was enjoying cold drinks and frozen desserts made with ice harvested from its own pond and stored through the warmer months. According to the surviving evidence, Frederick's older brother William casually suggested that this same ice might be valuable in the Caribbean. Frederick spent the rest of his life insisting the idea belonged entirely to him. He even ended a long friendship after the friend's wife mentioned William's role. The fairest conclusion is also the most revealing. William may have supplied the original thought. Frederick supplied the risk, the execution, and the obsession that followed. The arithmetic looked irresistible. Nature supplied frozen ponds, and ships sailing toward the Caribbean often had limited outward cargo. If Tudor could replace ballast with ice and sell enough before it melted, New England winter might become a valuable export. There was just one problem. Almost nobody believed the cargo would survive. Ship owners worried that melting ice would flood their holds and damage other goods. Tudor secured a brig called the Favorite and prepared his first shipment. In February 1806, a Boston newspaper announced that a vessel had cleared the custom house for Martinique, carrying a cargo of ice. It began with 2 dry words, "No joke." Then it wished Tudor well with what it called a slippery speculation. Accounts placed the cargo somewhere between 80 and 130 tons. Tudor had committed roughly $10,000 to an experiment most of Boston expected to fail. The newspaper was about to be proved right, but not for the reason people expected. Before the Favorite left Boston, Frederick sent William and their cousin James Savage ahead to Martinique to find customers and arrange storage. They created curiosity. They did not create an ice house. When Frederick arrived at Saint-Pierre, enough ice had survived to interest residents once he demonstrated cold drinks and frozen desserts. But interest did not solve the immediate problem. The ice had nowhere protected to go. There was no permanent commercial storage or established distribution network. The cargo had to be unloaded, explained, divided, and sold while tropical heat worked against every step. Sales could not keep pace with the melting. The experiment came up approximately $3,000 to $4,000 short, with other accounts placing the loss closer to $4,500. To his critics, frozen water did not belong on a ship. Tudor concluded that enough had survived to prove the voyage possible. The destination had failed the cargo. Even a perfect voyage would be worthless without storage, distribution, and customers who understood the product. The first cargo had revealed the missing pieces of the business. Tudor responded by sending more cargoes. In 1807, he tried Havana and did somewhat better. Then President Thomas Jefferson imposed an embargo that severely restricted American foreign trade, disrupting the routes Tudor was trying to establish. With ships blocked and debts accumulating, he returned to the family estate and began experimenting with model ice houses designed for tropical heat. At almost the same moment, the Tudor family suffered its own disaster. Frederic's father had invested heavily in a Boston land development scheme. It collapsed, taking much of the family fortune with it. He spent his remaining years living on a modest court salary while facing creditors of his own. Family wealth could no longer absorb Frederic's failures. The ice trade now carried his ambition and the hope of rebuilding what his family had lost. And the business was still nowhere close to working. By 1810, Tudor was nearly out of money. He later remembered feeling so poor and discouraged that he had become indifferent about what happened to him. Still, he found his way to Havana. There, he established better storage and secured an exclusive 6-year privilege to sell ice. For the first time, he had a building capable of holding it through Havana's hottest months. Gross sales reached roughly $7,400 and later approached $9,000. But Tudor received only a fraction of the money. He accused his agent of cheating him. A Jamaica venture went so badly that he felt fortunate when a cargo was lost at sea, because the wreck saved him a freight bill. The business could occasionally produce revenue. It still could not free him from debt. Then came the War of 1812, making Atlantic and Caribbean shipping more dangerous and disrupting Tudor's fragile routes. Tudor responded in characteristic fashion, with another invention and another gamble. He designed an experimental vessel called the Black Swan, hoping its unusual hull might find work in wartime privateering. On the day it was launched, a sheriff boarded the ship and arrested him for failing to pay a $300 note. Tudor was taken to the Cambridge jail. Weeks earlier, he had been confined for debt in Boston, and further imprisonment would follow. After 7 years, with his father facing creditors and his foreign trade unstable, the newspaper joke from 1806 looked less like mockery and more like a prediction. But when the war ended, Tudor assembled enough money for one more serious attempt in Havana. In 1815, he borrowed approximately $2,100 to purchase ice and construct a better ice house. The double-shelled structure measured about 25 feet square outside and could hold roughly 150 tons, with wood shavings packed around the storage chamber. It stood close to the landing point so cargo could move into storage quickly. On November 1st, Tudor left Boston for Havana, while creditors were still trying to stop him. He later described himself as pursued by sheriffs to the very wharf. The new ice house worked. Tudor could finally hold inventory after the ship departed, ration the supply, and continue selling through the hottest part of the year. Success did not make him cautious. In August 1816, Tudor borrowed another $3,000 at 40% interest. He packed Cuban fruit with ice and hay, hoping to profit on the return voyage to New York. Almost everything rotted during the month-long journey. Tudor could now see a future in the southbound trade, but his appetite for speculation kept creating new debts. What he needed now was not another experiment. He needed customers who would return every day. Beginning in 1817, Tudor expanded into the southern United States. Charleston, Savannah, and New Orleans offered shorter voyages, hot summers, and growing urban markets. Hotels wanted chilled drinks, food merchants wanted to slow spoilage, and hospitals used ice for medicines and fever. But Tudor still had to turn occasional curiosity into regular purchasing. His diary described a deliberate strategy: place ice with one conspicuous bartender and allow him to serve cold drinks without raising the price. Customers would begin preferring that establishment. Competing bartenders would then have to acquire ice or risk losing business. Customers did not need to understand the ice trade. They only needed to compare a cold drink with a warm one. He supported this with practical education. Advertisements explained when the ice house opened, how much customers can buy, how to carry ice home in blankets, and how to store it. One Charleston notice advised customers to use a warm, dry closet, explaining that materials which kept a person warm could also help keep ice cold. Instructions, fixed prices, regular hours, and dependable supply made the product easier to adopt. The results began to appear. In 1819, Tudor reported approximately $24,000 in profit from the ice trade that year. Then William Tudor re-entered the story. Frederic had spent years denying that his older brother deserved credit for the original idea. Yet in 1820, William used his social connections to help secure a $3,000 loan for Frederic. The money supported a new ice house in New Orleans, while the interest helped finance William's literary work. The brother Frederic, considered impractical, helped fund one of his most important markets. New Orleans accelerated the business, but years of debt and relentless anxiety had taken a physical toll. In 1822, Tudor suffered what a later historian described as a nervous collapse. He recovered and returned to work. By then, Tudor no longer had to prove that hot cities would buy ice. His southern markets showed that demand could become regular. The new problem was supply. Ice was still harvested largely by hand in irregular pieces that were slow to move and difficult to stack. The old method placed a ceiling on the business. Tudor had taught customers to expect ice. Now, New England had to produce it on an industrial scale. Breakthrough came through Nathaniel Jarvis Wyeth, a Cambridge businessman and inventor who became one of Tudor's most important suppliers. Wyeth approached a frozen pond less like a natural landscape and more like a factory floor. Workers cleared the snow and marked a large rectangle. Horses pulled cutting devices in straight passes, scoring parallel grooves. Crosswise passes turned the pond into a grid. Workers separated floating sections and guided uniform blocks toward the ice house. Wyeth patented an improved cutter in 1829 after developing the method for several years. Historical estimates suggest it reduced cutting costs from roughly 30 cents per ton to about 10. The shape of the block mattered just as much as the speed of cutting. Irregular pieces left gaps that circulated warm air and exposed more surface to melting. Uniform blocks fitted like masonry, behaving more like one large frozen mass. Wyeth also improved ice houses and handling equipment. Combined with Tudor's experiments, these changes reduced storage losses and made larger operations practical. By the late 1820s, the mature business depended on a chain of connected advantages. Nature supplied the raw material. Labor, horses, tools, pond rights, and ice houses turned it into inventory. Hay, sawdust, wood shavings, rice chaff, and dried tanning bark slowed heat. They were inexpensive, available, and effective in thick layers. Blocks were packed tightly below the waterline, and the hatches remained closed during the voyage. Ships traveling toward southern ports often had underused cargo space or carried ballast, allowing Tudor to negotiate relatively inexpensive outward freight. At the destination, ice houses reduced unloading time, while local agents monitored inventory and sales. Some melting was unavoidable. Tudor's business did not require every ton to survive, It required the remaining ice to sell for enough to cover the cost of everything that had melted along the way. Each market had different voyage times, storage losses, prices, and competition. Tudor had to estimate them before the ship left, and still deliver enough ice to sell profitably. By the middle of the 1820s, roughly 3,000 tons of ice were leaving Boston annually, and historical estimates credit Tudor with about 2/3 of the volume. His strange experiment had become an industry, and industries attract competitors. Tudor believed that because he had created the trade, he was entitled to control it. From the beginning, he pursued exclusive import and selling privileges from local governments. In Havana, legal protection combined with control of the ice house gave him a powerful position. In American cities, where exclusive rights were harder to obtain, he used the weakness of the product itself against new competitors. When a rival cargo arrived, Tudor could cut his price to around 1 cent per pound. A newcomer had to match the loss-making price or watch the cargo melt. Tudor had permanent storage, established agents, and revenue from other markets. Many rivals had one shipload, and only days before it disappeared. Once they withdrew, he could raise the price. He openly resented anyone attempting to profit from the trade without giving him credit. After hearing that a competitor's cargo had been lost, he admitted the news benefited him and wrote that the business was his because he had commenced it. His advantages could not prevent competition forever. Ice could not be patented. Frozen ponds were abundant, and other merchants could copy the system. To keep growing, he needed markets much farther away. In 1833, Boston merchant Samuel Austin approached Tudor with an extraordinary proposal. Austin's ships regularly sailed to Calcutta and needed profitable outward cargo. He believed the route might support a shipment of American ice at a favorable freight rate. Tudor brought nearly 3 decades of harvesting, insulation, and tropical storage experience. Austin brought the shipping connection. A third partner, William Rogers, agreed to represent the venture in Calcutta. It was a partnership, but no one involved had more experience losing ice and learning from it than Tudor. They selected the brig Tuscany and prepared the largest test of his system yet. The ice was loaded on May 6th and 7th, 1833. When the Tuscany sailed from Boston several days later, its hold contained approximately 180 tons. For a short Caribbean voyage, ice could be packed inside a hold lined with a few inches of insulating material and covered with hay. Calcutta required something more elaborate. The partners built what was effectively a sealed ice house inside the ship. A wooden floor was laid above roughly 1 foot of dried tanning bark, a cheap material that conducted heat poorly. Another layer of planks went over the bark, and the sides were built the same way. The mainmast, pump, and well were boxed in. Uniform blocks were packed closely, covered with about 1 foot of hay, and sealed beneath planking. The crew even installed gauges intended to show how far the ice sank as it melted. Then the hatches were closed. For 4 months and 7 days, the Tuscany crossed the equator, rounded the Cape of Good Hope, crossed the equator again, and entered the Bay of Bengal. The gauges disappointed because the ice melted between the blocks instead of shrinking evenly. The ship's changing draft allowed Agent J.J. Dixwell to estimate the losses. Approximately 55 tons were gone by the time the Tuscany reached Diamond Harbor near the mouth of the Hooghly. Another 6 to 8 tons disappeared during the journey upriver. Unloading in tropical heat cost perhaps 20 tons more. Finally, about 100 tons were deposited in a temporary ice house at Brightman's Got. Nearly 45% of the cargo had vanished. The surviving 55% proved that natural ice could cross the world and still arrive in commercial quantities. Ice was not unknown in India. Small quantities were produced locally and households used established cooling techniques. But clear blocks arriving by the 100-ton shipment represented a different scale. The early market remained heavily colonial and elite. British officials, European merchants, wealthy Indian households, hotels, clubs, and medical institutions could afford regular access. The East India Company granted imported ice duty-free treatment, and specialized ice houses later appeared in Calcutta, Madras, and Bombay. Even with that support, the first cargo did not sell as quickly as its partners had hoped. A contemporary report placed sales at no more than 10 maunds a day. Rogers priced the ice at 4 annas per seer, but customers still had to learn how to carry and preserve it. The report concluded that the public needed to be habituated to the product. The challenge from Martinique had followed Tudor to Calcutta. Delivery could introduce ice. Repeated use had to create dependable demand. This time, the infrastructure followed. Calcutta became one of Tudor's most profitable destinations, and regular shipments expanded through British India over the following years. Tudor had finally connected New England winter to tropical Asia. But while the Tuscany was proving what his ice business could do, another speculation was moving in the opposite direction. Tudor had been buying coffee on an enormous scale, and the price was beginning to fall. Tudor entered the coffee market partly because the specialized ice trade left him isolated from Boston's larger commercial community. Early profits encouraged him to buy more. Then prices turned against him. By the end of 1834, Tudor estimated his coffee losses at approximately $175,000. Once the obligations were organized, the principal debt exceeded $210,000. His creditors proposed that he continue operating the ice business as their supervised agent, while limiting his personal expenses. Tudor refused. He argued that restrictions would weaken the one business capable of paying them back. Give him operational freedom, he said, and he would repay the principal, with interest. Remarkably, they agreed. The task took 14 years. Tudor expanded the Calcutta trade and drew revenue from established markets. He also lost control of Havana for nearly a decade during a dispute with a former associate. Growth demanded more investment in ships, ice houses, pond access, and land. Still, the repayments continued. In January 1849, at 65 years old, Tudor announced that he had paid $210,094.20 in principal, and another $70,060.39 in interest. The total was $280,154.59. The man, once taken from his ship over a $300 note, had repaid one of the largest personal business losses of his era. By then, Tudor owned valuable real estate and an international business. Henry David Thoreau, watching workers harvest Walden Pond in 1846 and 1847, described the operator behind them as worth roughly $500,000. Later historians believe Tudor may have been closer to a millionaire. He began looking for younger men to take over the business in 1852, nearly 47 years after the first Martinique voyage. He died at his Boston home in February 1864, at the age of 80. By that time, Tudor no longer controlled the industry he had created. Other merchants shipped New England ice across the United States and around the world. Competition spread, and natural ice commerce continued for decades before artificial ice and mechanical refrigeration gradually replaced it. Frederic Tudor had wanted the trade to remain his. His greatest proof of success was that it had become too large for any one man to own.